Good morning, everyone. All right, we're in LA. They smile and they have sunshine here. Sometimes. Okay, well, good morning. We are here and we are honored to have with us today Howard Ross. Howard is a globally recognized expert and leader in diversity and inclusion. Howard advises senior executives from around the world, and he helps them with leadership development and organizational transformation. So with that, I want to say welcome, Howard.
Thanks, Singleton. Good to be here.
Listen, I'm not going to take up a lot of your time, but I have a couple questions.
Sure.
The first is, look, as you know, we've tried a lot of training programs, initiatives in the diversity and inclusion space. How is unconscious bias training and intervention any different?
Well, I could start asking a quick question for everybody. How many people out here, if you really admit it, would say you're suffering a little bit from diversity fatigue? Like, you know, a little tired of hearing about it. I know some people are scared to raise their hand, but that's, you know, that's kind of out there. One of the challenges that we've had, Singleton, is that from the early days of doing diversity work, we sort of approached it from a social justice, more political standpoint. We were trying to fix a problem. Yeah. And it was necessary, and it still is necessary to some degree. But what's happened is over the years, we've realized that there's something far deeper here, which is that our fundamental ways of operating in business, I mean, we just saw this in some of the examples that Mark gave us, our fundamental ways of operating are run by dynamics that we're not even clear about. I mean, I don't care what people's politics are. I don't care whether you're a Democrat or Republican or a liberal or conservative. You know, if we make decisions about how to hire people based on impulsive triggers that we don't even know are there, we may as well be rolling the dice to determine if we hire the best person. You know, if we make determinations about how to present ourselves to the public in a way that's from only our point of view, when we know that there are people out there who are looking from a completely different point of view, we may as well be rolling the dice to determine whether or not that product is going to be successful. So what we're trying to do is to look at, from a competency standpoint, how does this affect the workforce, getting the best people, keeping the best people, the workplace, creating an environment where people can really function at their best together, and the marketplace. How do we speak to that marketplace that's increasingly diverse? This is a fundamental business issue, regardless of what our politics are.
That sounds right. Well, why is it important, though, that we do this work now?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I mean, first, we've got more diversity in our workforce than ever before in history, and that's going to increase. That's not, again, it's not about politics, it's just about demographics. And secondly, we've got a lot going on around us, in case anybody hasn't noticed, in the world. Right. And it's silly to think that we don't bring that to work with us. When somebody gets upset by something at the news about a particular kind of person and they come to work with that exact kind of person, it could be in that relationship. So the more conscious we can be, the more mindful we can be about the decisions we make, the more likely we are to create an inclusive work environment.
Okay. Well, then with that, I'm going to leave you. I'd like to say a couple things. You all should have had one of these books on your seat when you came this morning. It's the Competitive Edge Guide. It is a guidance tool book that was developed by the 4A's to help you guys think more about unconscious bias. Great tools developed in partnership with Howard and his amazing wife, Leslie Traub. So I encourage you to look at it, read it, take it with you, and use this tool book. Okay, and then Howard is with us for the rest of the day, so after he's done here, feel free to tackle him in the hallway and just take as much of his insight and information as you can, okay? Great. Listen, thank you. This is your audience.
Thanks, Singleton. I appreciate it. Thanks. Good. Good morning, everybody. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was down in Jackson, Mississippi, doing some work with the folks at Jackson State University with the faculty and deans there for a couple of days. And I had to fly from there to New York to work with another client. And so in order to get there, I had to transfer through Memphis, Tennessee. So I get to the Memphis airport in time for the last flight out. I get to my gate, and as soon as I get to my gate, the gate attendant comes on with an announcement and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, there'll be a 45-minute delay." And the words were barely out of her mouth when a voice booms out from behind me. "You talking to us, lady?" And I turn around, and sitting behind me is a guy who I would best describe as Santa Claus with an attitude. Yeah. Older white guy, big white beard, white hair, overalls, a flannel shirt, and a car magazine in his hand. Yeah, I chuckled too. Yeah. So I went about my business. I was working on a PowerPoint deck that I was going to be using the next day, and comes time to get on the airplane. I get to my seat, and lo and behold, who's sitting next to me but Angry Santa? Yeah. So we did the nod. I know those of you who travel a lot know what I'm talking about. You know, you kind of acknowledge each other and then go into your zone in parallel play mode. And I'm on my computer, he's reading his magazine as we fly to New York for a couple hours until the pilot comes on and says it's time for initial descent to LaGuardia. Now, flyers know, regular flyers know that this is when airplane chat starts because it's now safe to talk to the person next to you. You're not going to get roped into a 2-hour conversation with a lunatic, right? So I turn to the guy and I say, what's taking you to New York? And he says, I have a professional meeting. So I'm thinking, car dealership, you know. And I said, what do you do? He says, I'm a radiologist. Boom, there goes that picture, right? And then a little nonplussed and frankly embarrassed that after doing diversity and inclusion work professionally for more than 30 years, I'm still stereotyping people. I say, well, what kind of radiology? And he gets really animated. He says, well, I couldn't help but look at your PowerPoint. You'll probably be really interested in this. We're actually using functional magnetic resonating imagery to watch people's brain and to see how the brain responds when people interact with different kinds of people. Yes, he's studying exactly the thing that I'm the most interested in. And had I not pegged him as Angry Santa the car mechanic, I probably could have learned more from him in those 2 hours than 2 months of research on my book, you know. So I start with that story, and I could give you a dozen more because I'm not here to talk about you or fixing you. I'm here to talk about us as human beings. This is what we do, isn't it? You know, I was at the reception the other evening, and I was just standing around the periphery for a while watching people walk in and watching how people stopped for a second, looked around the room, and then went directly over to somebody they knew. 9 times out of 10. You know, or we make this little mental calculation if we don't know anybody. Who feels safe to go up to? Who looks welcoming to go up to? I mean, is there anybody here who hasn't had that experience? This is how we relate to the world. So I want to talk about that a little bit and talk about the mechanics behind that. Inside of this context, how much do we really know?
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
That's right, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you? Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
Good. So, how many of people in this room who are intelligent, competent people, who are trained to watch advertisements, how many of you noticed more than 3, 4, 5 changes in that video? I don't see a single hand up. See, it has nothing to do with intelligence, competence, or anything else. It's got to do with a phenomenon we call selective attention. We see certain things, and we don't see others, depending upon what we're oriented towards. How many of you have been in a meeting, and something happened in that meeting, an interaction between people, and you walked out of the meeting, and you say to somebody, did you see that? And they say, what? What are you talking about? Anybody see that happen? Yeah, a lot of women have their hands up. Yeah, yeah. This is a phenomenon. So we don't see the world exactly as it is. We see the world through the lens of our experience. And the same is true for how we hear the world. So I'm going to do a little experiment here. I want to divide the room in half. I'd like all of you folks in just a moment to close your eyes. I promise I won't let them take your stuff. Folks over here, you keep your eyes open. I'm going to show a little 5-second video clip and ask you what you hear. Okay, so close your eyes over here. Here we go. Ba, 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 ba. Good. So open your eyes. So if you heard ba ba, please stand up. If you heard ba ba, just stand so we can see. Okay, so look around the room. Interesting. Okay, you can sit down, thank you. If you heard something like da-da or gaga, stand up, or la-la, sometimes a little L. Interesting. All right, I'm going to show the video again. Thank you. I'm going to show the video again. This time you can open and close your eyes at intervals. You'll actually hear it change right before your eyes. Okay, can we roll it again? Here we go. Ba, 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 ba. Now, aside from being way cool, what does this teach us? We actually hear with our eyes more than we realize. In this case, it happens because the sound he's saying is actually ba-ba. You heard the accurate sound. But the video is of him saying gaga, and unconsciously we really read lips. So over here what happened was your brain had to morph those two signals, the video and the audio signal. Shows up for most people as a D or a G sound. But the point is, we do this all the time. We do it because of what we see and hear. We do it because of what we're prepared to see and hear, what our minds are primed to. For example, I spent a year as a professor of diversity and residence at Bennett College for Women, which is a historically black college in Greensboro, North Carolina. And one day I was having lunch with the president of the college in her office and 3 other people. And Bennett being a Methodist school in the South, they pray over everything down there. So, of course, before lunch, somebody said a prayer, and it was a Christian prayer and invoked Jesus, and I'm Jewish. Now, I wasn't at all offended by that. My wife actually grew up in a Christian home. But it brings it up to awareness. So we open our eyes, and the person next to me turns to the person next to him and says, by the way, we also have Jews here. And I thought to myself, well, that was a nice attempt on his part to be inclusive, until she responded by saying, no, water's fine, thank you. Juice. He said juice. But because of what I was primed to hear, what did I hear, right? The same phenomenon shows up sometimes in workplace decisions. Let me show you an example in this little clip from a study that ABC News ran.
What do you feel about her as a job candidate?
I know the Windows operating systems like the back of my hand, no problem.
Now, listen to him.
I know the Windows operating systems like the back of my hand, no problem.
The candidates in these videos are actors in a Yale University hiring experiment. The resumes identical. The interviews identical.
I'm extremely good at sizing up people quickly
and then delegating responsibility accordingly.
The only difference is gender. But when it comes to who got the job,
I thought the male applicant had better soft skills.
So the woman was arrogant and overselling.
in hundreds of evaluations, the female job seekers come off as more aggressive, are rated less likable, and they're less likely to be hired.
Isn't it a catch-22? You're supposed to be strong to get that job, and you're saying if you're too strong, you won't get it. You need to behave in this dominant way to advance as a woman in the workplace, but you're seen negatively because that's not how we expect women to behave.
And if you think this is just male bias, it's not. Both men and women doing the hiring made the same call.
I think there's a level of arrogance that might be okay to be a manager, but then there's a step above, and I thought she was slightly above that.
So let's talk.
And when we revealed our study results,
I was surprised by my reaction.
What does that say about us?
We have a long way to go.
Yes, indeed, we do, don't we? This is the nature of who human beings are. And as my good friend Sukhvinder Singh Obi, who heads the Brain, Body, and Action Lab at McMaster University, says our brains seem to evolve to be good enough most of the time. Our brains actually guess about what's going on in the world, and we know this now through neuro and cognitive research. A lot of you have studied that, I know, in relationship to your business. We're making quick guesses, and we've got a voluminous body of research now, 1,500 studies in the last 10 years alone about the way this shows up. Just a couple of examples. Researchers at Northwestern and Yale University sent men and women out into car dealerships in Chicago to buy cars. They were as identical as they could find relative to age, body shape and size, clothing, financial resources that they supposedly had, all this, except some were white, some were black, some were men, and some were women. Men were offered the cars on average $725 over invoice. White men, excuse me, $725 over invoice price. White women, $935, 30% more. Black women, $1,195, 70% more. And black men, $1,687, 230% more. And what the researcher said to me was, we expected a difference. We didn't expect it to be so large, but what really blew our minds was that when we went and interviewed the car salesmen, none of them seemed to have any conscious idea that there was any pattern to what they were doing. In other words, for the car salesmen, they were trying to get what they could from each sale. But they had all kinds of projections and expectations about whether the person was serious about buying, whether they were just a looker rather than a buyer, all of these kinds of things that led to these results. Another example, height. Less than 60%, or excuse me, more than 60% of American men are over 6 foot, excuse me, less than 60% of American men are over 6 foot tall, and yet, you know something, I apologize. Less than 14% of American men are over 6 foot tall, and 60% of corporate CEOs are over 6 foot tall. Why? What do we associate with height? In fact, an inch of height is worth about $789 a year in corporate America. Now, personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with this one. That's probably why I flubbed the line, you know, so. Okay, another one, names. We have studies in the United States, in Singapore, in England, all over the world, in Sweden, that say that when certain names with an ethnic connection are on a resume, people are more or less likely to hire that person when everything on a resume is exactly the same. For example, in the United States, if the name sounds more white, traditionally, for example, Gregory and Emily, versus more African American, like Keisha and Jamal, people are 50% more likely to call that person back. The same exact resume, word for word. Here's another one, accent. We know that for the most part, people tend to trust the credibility of information when it comes with people from the same accent from ours, and distrust it when it comes from people with a different accent, with one exception. Anybody want to guess? That's right, British. We not only think they make better movie villains, we also think they're smarter. Yeah. One of the folks who works in one of the agencies in New York City that we've worked with came from Liverpool, and in Liverpool they speak a form of English called Scouse, or I think it's Scouse or Scouse, I forget, Scouse, thank you. And which he said he was told his whole childhood was gutter English. That was his terminology. He says, whenever I fly home to visit my family and then fly back to New York, I feel myself getting smarter every mile I fly. You know? Yeah. So the question is not, do we have bias? Because I can give you an example, if we had more time, for every single dynamic of identity you can imagine. The question is, which are ours? And I want to take this apart for just a minute in terms of how the mechanism of this works. Now, for the most part, how many people associate the word bias with negative behavior? Now, that's sort of the way we've expressed it, especially in the diversity space. Bias equals badness. But the reality is bias is neither good nor bad. It's simply a function of the brain. It's an automatic conscious or unconscious tendency or inclination that results in judgment without question. It's a shortcut for us to make determinations. Sometimes it can be enormously valuable for the brain to act this way. If I, for example, take this and throw it at one of you, you don't say, oh, I wonder what happens when it gets here. Your hand would shoot up. That same mechanism is what has us very quickly assess a person. Are they safe or not safe? Friendly or not friendly? Competent or not competent? Now, when you're driving a car and the car stops short in front of you and that taillight comes on, it's a good idea not to sit and say to yourself, all right, what am I supposed to do now? And to trust your instinctive reaction to hit the brake. But when that same bias results, for example, in a police officer pulling a trigger too quickly, then we got a real problem. Or when it results in our kind of trusting our gut on going with this person rather than that person, because without even realizing it, this person reminds us of a beloved cousin, which has absolutely nothing to do, of course, with the job at hand. The reason we have bias, of course, is because our human danger detector probably goes back thousands and thousands of years ago. When we were living in caves and jungles, we'd see a group of people around the waterhole, and we'd say, is that them or us? And making the right determination would determine if we lived or died. This has a tendency to focus people's behavior, you notice. So we make these very quick determinations. So the problem is, of course, that our unconscious bias can often conflict with our conscious attitudes, behaviors, and intentions. And so we could talk about this, but at the heart of it, what we need to understand is we don't think the way we think we think. One of the great myths of Western culture is that we're rational. This goes way back to Plato, 2,500 years ago. Plato was the one who said the rational mind was like the charioteer who holds the raging emotions in place. You probably remember that from Philosophy 101, the Phaedrus dialogues, I think it was. And for 2,500 years, we've worshipped at the altar of the rational. You sure you're being rational about that? You sure you're not being emotional? As if thinking rationally is better than thinking emotionally. The only problem is every decision we make starts with an emotional reaction. We actually gather the information to justify that decision after we've had an impulse to go in one direction or another. And so we can see this now happening in the brain because we're understanding more and more about the mind. We know we all have an internalized book of rules. If I went out and stuck my hand out like this to one of you in the crowd, if we had time, you would take your hand out to shake because that's the way we greet each other in this culture. Now, if my hand was very, very soft, had very, very little pressure, how many people would feel, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but how many people would feel like a little uncomfortable with that? And some of you have even heard somebody say, if somebody shakes hands like that with me at the beginning of an interview, forget it, the interview might as well be over. Now let's think about this for a minute. 30 to 40% of the world shakes hands that way. So we've already eliminated about a third of the world culturally. You've also eliminated people who have a disability, having nothing to do with their competency in any other areas. You've eliminated people who have an injury or people who are recovering from an injury. And all of this is because we made up this rule for the purpose of having a shortcut. And we could go on and on if we had time. You could talk about some of the rules that you've made up, both in your field and also interpersonal relationships, about how this plays out. This leads to the development of schema. Schema are framing mechanisms of the mind that have us see certain things and not others. Let me give you an example. Take a look at this picture and see if you can identify anything recognizable in this picture. How many of you see something recognizable? What do you see? Can you shout it out for me? Yeah. Did you ever hand up? Somebody? Cow. How many people see the cow? Okay, I see about maybe 15 people in the room. I'll make it easier for you. Okay, so I superimposed a picture of a cow. Anybody who doesn't see the cow now, we can do a remedial session at lunch. So, okay. All right, we'll go back to the picture. And now tell me now if you can avoid seeing the cow in the original picture. So something that was invisible a moment ago, just like that, I flipped your schema. Now, all of a sudden, you see things that you didn't see before. This is the way the brain works. We see certain things and not others, depending upon the worldview that we have. And that creates a particular background platform that we look at the world through. It's almost like if you were to consider like a lens or pair of glasses or contact lenses that you have on your eyes that you don't know are there. And the world then looks like that lens says it looks. So if it's a red lens, you see red. If it's a blue lens, you see blue. And when we come together across with people who have different lenses, what do we usually do? We determine that they're either stupid, evil, wrong, or bad. We never even consider most of the time what lens are we seeing through. And this is the real challenge, because unless we start looking at the lens we're seeing things through, we're not going to understand that. Now, this leads to projection. Now, projection happens in interesting ways. Let me give you an example, because we really make stuff up about people. So your son or your daughter is grown, let's say. They call you, Mom, Dad, I'm in love. I can't wait to introduce you to him. He's like the best guy in the world. I can't wait for you to meet him at the holidays. You can't wait, so you go on Facebook. And you see him with two men, this one and this one. Who you hoping for? Right? Well, it turns out the guy on the left is named John Fetterman. He's the mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania. That's his zip code on his arm. He went to Harvard, served in AmeriCorps. He's, by the way, 6'10", 300 pounds. He did such an amazing job of transforming his city, which was an abandoned steel town, that he was reelected with 75% of the vote and recently ran for Senate in the state of Pennsylvania, finished second in the Democratic primary. The guy on the right is Ted Bundy, the serial killer. Or this picture. What visceral feeling does this picture bring up versus when we see the rest of it? Or this picture. Who are these 5 women? These are 5 US astronauts. Or this picture. Is this a militia initiation? No, these are 2 men getting married, the first day of marriage equality in the state of Washington. This is the way the mind works. We do this. We make things up about people. And in your case, that means who do you hire? Who do you give assignments to? Who do you take a risk with? How do you present things to the public? Now we know this happens because the brain functions in these 2 ways, fast brain, slow brain, as we just heard. We have these fast brain functions. We see things very quickly. And in the fast brain, we make very fast associations. Now, we just saw this in some of the commercials that Mark showed us. That first Pampers commercial is a great example. What does the first Pampers commercial do? Baby and cute older sibling. Baby, a nice man carrying him up the steps. Baby and grandma learning to read. Baby. Pampers. We don't even know what the commercial is about until the last frame. This is complete fast brain emotion tagged onto the product. This industry knows this better than anybody. Been doing it for years. Breasts, beer, breasts, cigarettes, breasts, restaurants, breasts, anything. Right? We make these fast associations. And fast associations, as I said before, can be incredibly helpful to us, but they can also be incredibly blinding because they're not necessarily very accurate. Now, we also have the capacity in the prefrontal cortex, this amazing part of the human brain, 5 times more active than any other animal, to see ourselves thinking. We have thoughts like, what made us think that? Now, this is where this work comes into play, is how do we strengthen our ability to apply prefrontal thinking at the times when we need to so that we can watch what's going on over here. Oh, I'm reacting to her because she reminds me of somebody positively. Let me make sure I don't give her a softball interview, or the opposite. Now, I can show you how the two brains work. We're going to do a little exercise. So when you see these letter combinations, what I'd like you to do is simply speak out loud the color of the font that you see. Okay, that's all. Don't worry about what the letters say. Some of them are mixed up letters, some of them are words. Doesn't matter. But speak it out loud. Let's practice one. Okay, here we go. We're going to go fast. Very good. Okay, you did great. Now let's do it one more time. They're pretty easy, right? We'll do it again. Here we go. What happened? Same assignment, right? What happened was you just felt the tug of war between your fast and slow brain. The the instruction I gave you was a very easy slow brain instruction. You had no problem with it. The second time you gave yourself a fast brain instruction you've been learning since you were this high, which was letters mean words. And how many of you noticed that the R for red came up before green? Right? That's because the fast brain is the older sibling of the slow brain. First of all, it's about 100 million years older from an evolutionary standpoint. And because it's survival-oriented, it's the first thing that comes up for us. Now let's put this into a work environment. Singleton comes in to do an interview with me for a job posting for a leadership position. My slow brain really, and I mean genuinely really, not BSing, but really put me on a lie detector test, believes that it would be great for us to have women of color in leadership positions. But my fast brain is quietly and unconsciously saying things like, she just doesn't have that executive presence. And that tug of war occurs in that interview. I just don't feel quite as comfortable. And it has nothing to do with whether or not you're a good person. My experience of working with hundreds of thousands of people now over more than 30 years, very few people wake up in the morning and say, how can I oppress the women in my organization today? How can I hold down the people of color? And yet the problem with the traditional way we've done diversity work is that we've looked at that 15 or 20% and focused 80% of our attention on them, as opposed to speaking to most people who just want to do a good job, treat people fairly, and help them do that. And so what we've learned is that the unconscious is malleable, and that there's 6 basic things that we're beginning to train people to use this muscle to help us begin to see how we make better decisions. And once again, this is, I mean, I believe in fairness and equity. I've worked for it my whole life. I went to my first civil rights meeting 51 years ago when I was 15 years old. You know, so I believe in that. But in a business environment, the business of business is business. And the real question is, how do we make good decisions? How do we hire people rather than rolling the dice to see if they're the right person? So the 6 things are, first of all, to recognize and accept that you have bias. Yes, you, me too. We all do. The question is not, do I have bias? The question is, what are my biases here? When you get together and you're doing hiring, when you're getting together and you're looking at an ad campaign, the question we should be asking ourselves is, okay, let's take a minute and check in. What biases are we bringing to this? Because they're always there for every human being. The brain is designed that way. And when we act like bias is only there if we're being bad, we miss the point completely. The second is, in order to do that, to develop a capacity, we like to use the metaphor to put a flashlight on yourselves. What's triggering this reaction in me? Is this person reminding me of somebody? You know, one way to think about it is if you're hysterical, it's probably historical. You know, if you have a strong emotional reaction, you can almost guarantee that it's triggering something from your past. The third is to practice what I call constructive uncertainty. At certain times, to slow down a little bit, to pause and say, okay, maybe you should get somebody else to look at this. Maybe I should sleep on it. Because the faster we move, the more the fast brain has to kick in. Fourth is to watch where awkwardness and discomfort is there and to look at it, to express it, to talk about it, or even to process it in yourself. What's triggering me here? What's bringing up this discomfort? We have a tendency to run away from it and make it go away, want to make it go away. And also, one of the things we found is engaging with people you consider others and exposing yourself to positive role models. This is why some of the advertising that Mark showed us is so valuable, because it gives people positive role models to see. It gives those wonderful advertisements showing little girls doing things that we don't necessarily historically associate. Incredibly important to change those bias systems. And lastly, to give and receive feedback. And one last thing I want to talk about very briefly is on a systemic level, because that's personally. A lot of people are hearing that, well, you know, Yeah, but training doesn't work. Well, first of all, a couple things about that. There's some great research that shows that traditional diversity training has fallen short at times. And that's legitimate research. The problem with it is it throws all of the training into one bucket. It's like saying, do you like restaurants? Most of us would say, which restaurant are you talking about? What we do know is training that teaches people to understand how they make decisions has actually been shown to be incredibly effective in creating more egalitarian balanced behavior. So getting the right kind of education. But education in and of itself is like joining the gym. It doesn't get you into shape. So after that, we want to install priming techniques. So if you do a great training program, but you're not doing a performance review for 4 months, what are the odds of that affecting the performance review? Unless maybe you watch a little 2-minute video clip that says you're going into a performance review, here are 3 or 4 things to think about, to pay attention to. So installing priming techniques at the right place. To look at systems and structures. Are there better ways to interview, better ways to hire, better ways to make decisions? And we're learning tremendous amount. I mean, my book, Everyday Bias, there's 16 pages in the appendix of talent management alterations that we can make that have been shown to mitigate bias. Easy things like, for example, give people interviewing questions a couple days before they come into the interview will balance out introversion and extroversion, and also people who are English speakers of another language. To balance out those guys. There are all kinds of things we can do. And then finally, to put in systems of accountability that are more helpful than just how many are there. So obviously there's a lot more we could talk about in that regard, but I do want to leave you with the notion that simply doing training is a beginning. It doesn't solve the problem. We then have to put the systems and structures in place to make it happen. So I want to close with this picture. This is a picture of an aspen stand in Colorado. These trees are amazing. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen them. 80 to 100 feet tall, ramrod straight, remarkable. But there's something extraordinary about aspen trees that makes them, for me, a perfect metaphor for who we are as human beings. And that is they're not single trees at all. The way aspen trees grow is they're connected by a common root system. One tree sends out a runner, they call it a volunteer, which grows another tree. They're the largest intact organisms in the world. The largest one that they found in northern Utah is 8,000 trees, one plant. Now for me, that's a perfect metaphor for who we are as human beings, because on the surface, we see these remarkable differences that we have. Personality, race, gender, we could go through the whole list. But underneath the surface, what we know is that human beings basically process information in the same way. And what that means, if we really pay attention, is that if I grew up in your narrative, the story of your life, and you grew up in the story of my life, we would probably see the world exactly as each other see the world. And so when we look at each other, if we really understand that, what that tells us is, rather than saying, why do you see it that way? We could start saying, why do you see it that way? And in that curiosity lays the ability to create inclusive environments that work for everybody. Thank you all so much. Thank you.